While shooting The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf actor Ian McKellen was attempting to make the films gayer.
Ian McKellen was there, and he had the book in his hand. And he came up to me and he was like, remember, Sam grabs Frodo's hand. The fans will be looking for that.
I thought that might be missed by two resolutely heterosexual actors who mightn't appreciate that gay people like myself saw in a touch something perhaps more meaningful.
And the scene actually feels even gayer in the book. He ran to Frodo and took his left hand awkwardly and shyly. He stroked it gently, and then he blushed and turned hastily away. "It's warm," said Sam. "Meaning your hand, Mr. Frodo." What else could that have meant, Sam? What else could that possibly have meant? Gay interpretations of The Lord of the Rings go back to the beginning. Since publication, it's faced suspicion regarding the epic bromance and lack of ladies. A 1955 review said hardly one of the hobbits and men knows anything about women. Even the elves and the dwarves and the ents are boys irretrievably and will never come to puberty. By the time Tolkien's first biography was published in 1977, they felt the need to clarify that Tolkien and his friends were not homosexual, and that, by the age of 19, Tolkien had never even heard the word homosexual. Tolkien and his bestie, Narnia author C.S. Lewis, were really into the importance of bromance, but Lewis became increasingly insistent that bromance was not the same as homomance. I'm going to be upfront about this. There is no way that Tolkien intended to write a gay romance. Despite the popular Polygon article asserting that he did, he 100% did not, and I can prove it. But fans such as my favourite commenter, "They're not gay, they're hobbits," are also wrong. Just because Tolkien didn't intend for it to be gay doesn't mean it isn't gay. Regardless of authorial intent, The Lord of the Rings feels gayer than a communist propaganda poster. From repeated kisses between Frodo and Sam to Sam just straight up saying he loves Frodo, the books are significantly gayer than anything in the film adaptations, which really downplay it. He kissed Frodo's forehead. Sam went to him and kissed his hand. Sam took his master's hands and laid them together, palm to palm, and kissed them, and then he held them gently between his own. They woke together hand in hand. Their hands met and clasped. Almost the touch was a caress. He tried to comfort Frodo with his arms and body. Yet are these moments actually gay? Are they gay hugs? Are they gay kisses? Is it gay deep hard f***ing? No. But, Polygon asks, how else would an author in the 1950s write about queerness? Wouldn't it be like this? No, it wouldn't. I'm sorry, Polygon, please don't take us off your best video essays of the year list. I love you. Tolkien fought in the First World War and said he based Sam on the Batman and privates he knew in the war. His relationship with Frodo is meant to be that of a Batman and his superior whom he cares for, expressing a devotion and loyalty which Tolkien had admired. So The Lord of the Rings can be read as World War I literature, and it's not uncommon for World War I literature to read as homoerotic. There is an intimacy between men fighting and dying together in the heart of war where there are no women to be seen, which disrupts our binaries when it comes to how straight men are meant to behave. The intimacy of a kiss while in battle or near death doesn't necessarily conform to our identity politics. And as has been documented, sometimes that kind of relationship involved things like men cooking and cleaning for each other, dancing together, reading to each other, and sleeping curled up against each other in close quarters. So that kind of intimacy is reflected in Sam and Frodo's relationship. And while their intimacy may seem suspiciously homoerotic, it really isn't that unusual in the correct context. And sure, Sam kisses Frodo's hand, but so does Merry kiss King Theoden's hand too. And the word love is also used to express passionate allegiance, which is exactly what Sam and Frodo's relationship is meant to be. By the time of World War II, it seemed like soldiers were already more self-conscious of seeming gay in their writings than World War I soldiers had been. But Tolkien's great World War I epic wouldn't be published until the 1950s. No wonder critics were so surprised by it. Time had moved on and the culture had changed. Polygon asked how an author in the 1950s would allude to queerness in his fiction. But the question should have been, how would an old Catholic World War I soldier write about straight men at war? Because the answer is, like this. But it must be gay, I hear the raging commenters type, because the book refers to Frodo as Sam's mate, like they're lovers. Well, no, not exactly. And either way, this rather has vibes of,
I just want a mate.
You just want to mate.
Tolkien does use the word mate elsewhere, and it seems unlikely that he was referring to the carnal meaning there too, unless this ruffian was referring to his polycule. So no, not gay. Do we also want to talk about Frodo selling his beautiful hole? Or there are queer folk about? Or They will come on you in the wild. Sam does in fact use the word boner at one point. Read into that what you will. The truth is, Tolkien was just an old fart, and these very obvious gay interpretations just didn't occur to him. This is the man who named Galadriel's husband Teleporno and one hobbit Knob. He was a sophisticated man, yes, but also a tad sheltered. Yet him being an old fart means we also end up with incredible lines about how queer Bilbo and Frodo are. Bag End's a queer place, and its folk are queerer. Now, queer definitely did mean gay at the time, but that's not what Tolkien meant. All the same, the odd bookish bachelors who like taking long walks in the woods, hanging out with androgynous foreigners, and never so much as glancing at lady hobbits, being referred to as queer, carries certain connotations. And the fact that their queerness, that is, their strangeness, alienates them from the conventional heterosexual local hobbits also feels very gay. A queer reading is very easy to stumble upon, and there are several good reasons for that. After all, it's not like heterosexual romances abound in these books. In the main text, the best you get out of the straight romances is when Arwen and Aragorn chat for a second. Aragorn stood beside her. They spoke together. That's it. We get Sam delicately wetting Frodo's entire hand for half the books, but outside the appendices, all Arwen gets is a brief chat. And then Éowyn's romance with Aragorn is grim and unrequited. Later, out of nowhere, she just hooks up with a bootleg Aragorn she hardly knows. Gimli fancies Galadriel, and he's like, excuse me, could I get some of your hair, madam? And Galadriel's like, yeah, okay. Sam and Rosie decide to get married only when she says, well, you've wasted a year, so why wait longer? The heterosexual romances of The Lord of the Rings will leave one feeling as dry as sandpaper. And where the books are almost exclusively about intimate relationships between men, the films tried to bring straight romance to the forefront while making an effort to no homo Sam and Frodo, despite Ian McKellen's best efforts.
Rosie caught dancing. She had ribbons in her hair.
But even then, Arwen's appearances aren't nearly as satisfying as the men's much more complex relationships. Arwen just floats into frame occasionally whispering, "Hello, Aragorn, I love you so much." No wonder people are shipping anyone they can get their hands on. If there's any eroticism in The Lord of the Rings, it certainly doesn't get to be between a man and a woman. And if anything, it's the one ring that really gets all the action. The books always describe it so sensually. Once more, the desire to slip on the ring came over Frodo, but this time it was stronger than before. So strong that almost before he realised what he was doing, his hand was groping in his pocket. A sudden temptation to put on the ring, the desire to do this laid hold of him, and he could think of nothing else. Something seemed to be compelling him to disregard all warnings, and he longed to yield. A lust which he could not conceal shone suddenly in his eyes. Oh my gosh, Von Ring, you're looking really good. Have you been working out? If there is any sensuality, any eroticism in the language of The Lord of the Rings, it's around Frodo and the ring. Everyone wants a piece of that ringussy. But despite how tame and innocent Lord of the Rings seems, Tolkien did actually think about sex in Middle-earth. In fact, he wrote about it in some detail. His notes even had a word for elven sexual desire, yerme. And the Silmarillion is super horny by Victorian Catholic standards. This is the sort of Bible of Middle-earth. Let's look at the tale of Beren and Luthien, the epic love story between a man and an elf, the ancestors who preceded Aragorn and Arwen. There's a part where Luthien uses her singing to seduce the evil Morgoth, who is basically the devil, the precursor to Sauron. Morgoth, looking upon her beauty, conceived in his thought an evil lust. Oh yeah, that's so hot, Tolkien, keep going, baby. But in his earliest drafts, from when he was much younger, Tolkien is even more frank about sex. For instance, instead of Luthien singing to seduce Morgoth, she does a sexy little dance for him. But that's an unusual example, because sex in Middle-earth is a very idealized conservative Catholic sex. For the elves, sex could only take place through marriage. In fact, to have sex was to become married. It was the ritual, along with a vow, that made you married. And you could only marry once, ever. Which is not surprising, as Tolkien didn't even believe in divorce or second marriages. Naturally, when C.S. Lewis married a divorced woman, Tolkien was very upset with him, and they couldn't hang out as much anymore. That Narnia slut. So after beginning the sexy phase of their relationship, purely for the sake of reproduction, of course, the elves would have a few kids and then just stop. Because bringing an elf baby to term took years and was too exhausting, so sex was just over. Except, as tame as this sounds, we need to take a second to dissect this next sentence, because it appears that Tolkien said in his notes that elves long and hard. The act of procreation does not take long, though it is longer and of more intense delight in elves than in men. Too intense to be long endured. I think this translates directly to Arwen f***ing destroyed Aragorn. I think it's possible that he meant to say that the whole process of reproduction from coitus through to birth is an intense one, but it does sound an awful lot like what he said was that elves fuck long and hard. And if he didn't mean to say that, well, then he really should have tried to express himself better in these private notes he never expected anyone to read. But all fun aside, as much as we would like to imagine, say, I don't know, Legolas and Gil-galad railing each other long and hard in true Tolkien fashion, I am loath to report that Tolkien said that it didn't count when it was gay. The elves had this idea of basically friend love, melme, but elf friend love was more intense than our friend love, a super intense special friendship, undoubtedly what Legolas felt for Gimli. And this could be shared between anyone regardless of their gender, but then there was also the word for sexual desire, yerme, but sexual desire, Tolkien said, could only be experienced between a man and a woman. This was only in notes published like half a century after his death, but it is a fact that Tolkien decided that the elves were all straight, or at least they were homophobes. Their culture believed that there was no such thing as gay sexual desire. So despite what early critics thought, sex very much exists in Middle-earth. It's just that there's a time and a place for sexuality, whether that be the innocent holy banging between man and wife or the evil lust of the devil. Idealized Catholic heterosexuality may be the standard sexuality in Middle-earth, including the long hard banging, of course, but as Morgoth's lust for Luthien proves, sexuality does exist outside of straight marriage, but you may have to go to Morgoth's fortress to see it. Sexuality exists outside of heterosexual marriage, but only in places such as the lands of evil. So, where could homosexuality exist in Middle-earth? Clearly not with the elves, seemingly not in the Shire, that's a very heterosexual place, but perhaps in Mordor, where the shadows lie, where Frodo and Sam are isolated, far away from the formality of their society, where the boundaries of class and friendship seem to be dismantled. Perhaps there the boundaries of Catholic heterosexuality can be dismantled too. When they return to the conventional straight Catholic-esque Shire and Sam is now obliged to marry and have kids, Frodo leaves Middle-earth, but suggests that Sam will join him someday, and the appendices prove that he does. Their reunion happens off-screen, so to speak, after Rosie has passed away, and the two men are hidden from view once again, beyond the boundaries of polite Shire society. I'm not saying Tolkien intended for that interpretation, but it makes sense for any audience who understands the rules of the real world, the rules of Catholic society even, seeing them reflected in Middle-earth, to then imagine that alternative sexualities would be shunned in polite society, but could come to the surface under the right circumstances, in the right environment, perhaps privately, far away from home even. So in the end, despite Tolkien's best efforts, the heterosexism and conservatism of The Lord of the Rings actually kind of makes it gayer. And homophobic fans who try to uphold the Catholic values of Tolkien and hobbits and elves aren't going to be able to convince anyone that far away from home and all alone, Frodo and Sam weren't able to share something special beyond those values. 21st century queer people aren't the audience The Lord of the Rings was written for, nor was it written for 21st century women who want to see Sean Astin and Elijah Wood make out. So we're going to have new, different readings than those Tolkien anticipated, new interpretations, new adaptations. Love between men reads differently to us than it would have to an old Catholic World War I soldier. And while straight men certainly should be allowed to more openly express affection for each other, you're not being oppressed just because some queer people like to think of Frodo and Sam having a little cuddle. Straight boys, this is really a problem you need to sort out for yourselves. But at the end of the day, God, it's a bummer that there's homophobic lore in Middle-earth. It's a bummer that Tolkien probably wouldn't approve of a gay reading. It sucks to think queerness is meant to be excluded from that world. Yet while Frodo and Sam were certainly not inspired by anything necessarily queer, is it possible that some other aspects of The Lord of the Rings may have been? Éowyn is a woman of the race of men, because that's how gender works in Lord of the Rings. She's been the carer of her uncle, the king, for some time now, who is under the influence of Wormtongue and Saruman. Gandalf appears and sort of awakens the king, like this. Blub, 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 blub. Éowyn immediately falls head over heels for Aragorn, but the affection isn't reciprocated. All the lads prepare to go to war, threatening to leave Éowyn behind, but Éowyn wants to fight. She wants to go to war too. There's a conversation between Éowyn and Aragorn in which they discuss Éowyn's role as a woman.
I fear neither death nor pain.
What do you fear, my lady?
A cage. To stay behind bars until use and old age accept them. And all chance of valor has gone beyond recall or desire.
She accuses Aragorn of suggesting that her place as a woman is in the home, and therefore she should not be allowed to come to war and go into battle with her brother and the king to defend their home in Middle-earth. So she dresses up as a bloke and secretly goes to war anyway in disguise, picking up Merry the Hobbit to give him a ride, but Merry doesn't, in the book anyway, realise that it's her. She goes into battle against the leader of the Ringwraiths, the Witch King of Angmar, and there is a prophecy that no living man will ever be able to kill the Witch King.
Dost thou not know the prophecy? No living man may hinder me.
No man can kill me.
I am no man.
Oh my gosh, wow, girl power, yes, horse spice. So Éowyn saves the day with some help from Merry and his magic sword, but her uncle sadly dies. And then to cap off her feminist victory in which she has proved she was as capable as any man, Éowyn hooks up with an off-brand version of Aragorn and they get married. She retires from fighting to become a healer and lives happily ever after. The end. Now, given everything we know about how conservative and old farty Tolkien was and how absent women are in The Lord of the Rings, it begs the question, why did Tolkien write this epic feminist battle sequence? I mean, Tolkien was definitely not a feminist. This was a man who once wrote to his son about the limited intellectual capacities of women. It's not a good look, Ronnie. So how did he end up writing this cool feminist horse girl who dresses as a man to defy the patriarchy and ride into battle, decapitate a monster and stab the Witch King in the face? Well, as her ending suggests, getting married off and retiring from warrior life, Éowyn is maybe not quite as feminist as she appears at first glance, though it's more complicated than that and maybe a little ambiguous. So before Arwen, you know what, I wish the names didn't both start with a vowel. They're so similar, this is getting really confusing. I wish one of them was just called like Barbara or something. You know what, we're just going to call Arwen Barbara. So despite the fact that the elf Barbara is Aragorn's one true love, the character of Barbara wasn't in earlier drafts. Tolkien came up with Éowyn before he came up with Barbara as Aragorn's potential love interest. Barbara is barely in the books before the appendices, largely because Tolkien just didn't come up with her until later. So in the first drafts, Éowyn isn't a troubled soul at all, but a beautiful love interest for Aragorn. It was only when Tolkien decided that Aragorn was too lordly and grim for Éowyn that he created the much more special and fancy Barbara to take him to Elvish Pound Town. So then Tolkien goes back and decides to make Éowyn a stern Amazon who should die in battle to save or avenge her uncle. So by this point, Éowyn's already gone from future wife to doomed warrior. But then Tolkien decides that he'll keep her love for Aragorn, but Aragorn will reject her. Then she'll dress up as a bloke and go into battle and die. When Éowyn confronts Aragorn about leaving her behind, she brings up feminist issues of the day, of the early 20th century. David M. Craig suggests the reader is meant to feel pity for her and think, with Aragorn, that her desires must be the product of a deeply troubled and unhappy mind. Éowyn is distinctly depressed by the time she goes into battle dressed as a man. She's ready to die in battle. That's what she's seeking. She's not a happy camper. Gandalf later explains that her depression, and thus her desire to perform manly feats, was the poison of Wormtongue, and thereby Saruman. Craig says that since Saruman represents 20th century progressiveness, it's interesting that he's the one behind her quite modern feminism. Though Tolkien originally planned for her to die for her gender transgressions, instead her happiness is restored, but only when she resumes her feminine role, falling in love with Faramir and retiring her sword to become a healer. But is it so simple? The gender binary in Middle-earth? Sure, she becomes a healer, but healer is also the role of the new king Aragorn.
Kingsfoil.
Kingsfoil, it's a weed.
It may help to slow the poison.
That's how Aragorn is recognised as the king, because of his healing abilities. Healing is not gendered. And actually, in the history of Middle-earth, the elves say that either men or women could be healers, as long as they abstained from hunting and killing. Melissa McCrory Hatcher argues that Éowyn's becoming a healer embodies Tolkien's highest ideal, his commitment to peace. I mean, look at Frodo at the end of the book, anti-violence, refusing to allow any killing. Peace and non-violence is the goal of this story, not the glory of war. And Jennifer Neville argues that Éowyn's role as a marginalised woman is what makes her story resonate with Sam and Frodo's. They're all essentially underdogs, small people fighting against impossible odds. So, Éowyn's relationship to gender is a little complicated. But why am I so focused on this in a video about queer Lord of the Rings? It's not like Éowyn is meant to be trans or anything. Last year, I wanted to make a video about Lord of the Rings and gender, and I wanted to research Éowyn and figure out where the inspiration for her character came from. But then, my research started to get a bit weird because, I get a little obsessive, and unfortunately, videos like these allow me room to be a bit strange when it comes to my interests, which is why this video is about to get a bit weird. But please, I just want to reassure you that whatever happens from this point on in the video, that it's fine. I'm fine. I'm normal. Tolkien was notoriously vague about his sources of inspiration, so scholars are constantly trying to figure out which works he read and what might have inspired him. Usually Éowyn is said to be inspired by figures such as Norse Valkyries, some of whom dressed up as blokes and went to war. Was Éowyn inspired by Hervor, who became a sea captain and summoned her father from the dead to yell at him for not giving her his sword? I guess she could have been. It doesn't sound much like Éowyn though, does it? Day's Dictionary of Sources of Tolkien claims that Éowyn was mostly inspired by Brynhild, the Valkyrie who was pricked by a thorn and turned into Sleeping Beauty in a castle surrounded by fire. Okay. Does that sound like Éowyn though? I feel like Fiona from Shrek has more in common with Brynhild. Some of these writers are just like, yes, Éowyn was inspired by this Valkyrie because they were both women and they both had hair. But none of these characters felt familiar to me. They didn't give me that aha moment of recognition. They don't have the vibes, you know? My research had left me dejected. It seemed that all had come to naught. And then one day, I was taking my morning constitutional when I came upon an establishment for the sale of books. As a follower of great literature, I picked up a new comic called The Girl Who Wasn't Afraid of Bears, the story of a girl who dresses up as a boy to become a warrior and goes off on an adventure, ultimately being magically transformed into a boy. This comic, I learned, was based on a common fairy tale, variations of which appear all across Europe. It usually begins with a daughter who wants to become a warrior or a soldier, but of course only boys can be warriors or soldiers, so she dresses as a boy and leaves home, often with a magical horse who can give her advice on how to be a man and assist her on her manly quests, righting wrongs, rescuing the damsel. But at the end of the tale, she becomes he through a magical gender transition, becoming Prince Charming. Sometimes this is through actively seeking that magic with a fox or a unicorn performing the transformation. In others, the transformation is because of a curse, some snakes or a hermit, or someone is angry with Prince Charming but unsure of their gender, so the curse is usually something to the effect of, if he was a man, he might become a woman. If she was a woman, she might become a man. There are even some variations which say, if she were a girl, let her get a penis as a stallion has. If he was a boy, let him get genitals as a field gate. Okay, but you know what? It's only a curse if the person isn't into it, am I right? In the Romanian version, published in English in 1901 in the Violet Fairy book, the girl is transformed into Prince Charming and marries a woman, more than happy to have transitioned. The princess suddenly felt she was really the man she had pretended to be. In an Albanian version, before transitioning, our hero marries the princess, but on their wedding night, their marriage is not consummated. It's only after his magical transition that the princess is able to announce that she had a wonderful night with her new husband. Even though this isn't even one of the versions where he has a massive wiener. Fellas, it's what you do with it that counts. There are many interpretations of this tale, all equally valid. Perhaps it's a feminist tale, a story about how women are just as capable as men. Or perhaps it's a sexist one, about how a woman has to become a man to be as valid as men. It could be a lesbian fairy tale, about women falling in love with an unfortunate homophobic ending forcing the lesbian to become a man. Or maybe it's about a transgender hero, literally being about someone crossing genders socially and later biologically. I wonder what the waitlist is like to see the gender transition unicorn. But while reading this version of the fairy tale in the Violet Fairy book, The Girl Who Pretended to Be a Boy, something occurred to me. The hero, dressed up for the first time as a boy, is fighting a dragon. She decapitates the dragon, or one of its heads anyway. And that's when I thought, this scene feels terribly familiar somehow. Complete with a figure rising from the dragon's corpse, this moment felt very much like Éowyn fighting the fell beast and the Witch King in The Lord of the Rings. The fight lasted an hour and the dragon pressed her hard, but in the end, by a well-directed side blow, she cut off one of the heads, and with a roar that seemed to rend the heavens in two, the dragon fell back on the ground and rose as a man before her. I mean, come on, it's the vibes, right? It gives you the vibes. And you know what? Just like transgender Prince Charming, Éowyn rails against her role in society, her gender role, something you don't really get from the Norse Valkyries. Prince Charming's father won't let her become a warrior because she's a girl, and she has to dress up as a boy and fight the dragon in order to prove her worth, as Éowyn has to disguise herself and go into battle and defeat the fell beast and the Witch King. And I was just like, gee whiz, what a coincidence. So the Violet Fairy book was one of Andrew Lang's coloured fairy books. There's a whole rainbow of them, the yellow fairy book, the red fairy book, and they contain fairy stories and myths from all over the world. And where, oh where, had I heard of these books before? Well, I had just read Tolkien's biography, and it said that when Tolkien was a child, he loved many stories, but most of all, he found delight in the fairy books of Andrew Lang. Okay, what? Okay, could it be that Tolkien was inspired by this weird old transgender fairy story? Is it possible to verify that at least one small part of The Lord of the Rings, the most influential fantasy series of all time, took inspiration from a very queer, very trans fairy story? Is it possible that I spent the last few months obsessed with a topic that no one's going to want to watch a video about, and now I just have to make one anyway? So let's investigate. As I said, Tolkien was tight-lipped about his inspirations and influences. It's very hard to say for certain what exactly inspired The Lord of the Rings. But if you look at the rest of Lang's fairy books, they often feel very familiar. The Green Fairy book contains a story called The Enchanted Ring, about a ring which can turn you invisible. But the hero realizes there is great temptation in the power of the ring, a gift as dangerous as it is powerful, and which I fear to use wrongfully. In The Dragon of the North, an invisibility ring has an inscription written in a mysterious text, which a magician must study for weeks to translate. Come on, I mean, surely that is Gandalf and the One Ring. Surely it is. It can't be a coincidence that Tolkien was reading about magical invisibility rings with inscriptions, with wizards, and a fear of temptation. It can't be. For Tolkien, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were an exercise in writing fairy stories. And while he's clearly not adapting these tales directly, it's these little moments, these little images, which seem to be echoed in his own work. So to further my investigation, I decided it was time to learn more about Tolkien's relationship to fairy tales, and I checked out his essay on fairy stories. In it, he explores where fairy tales come from and how they evolve over time. He imagined that the way stories grow and evolve is like cooking. You have a pot on the stove. Into this pot, you throw all sorts of ingredients, little pieces of story, of myth, cutlets of the real world, and they all get stirred and mixed up. So a story about a girl who dresses as a boy goes in, stories about dragons and magic rings with inscriptions. Then along comes the author to serve up the story, the soup of story. But the author is selective, making sure to choose only the best bits with his ladle. The author is, at least in theory, a good cook. Which brings me to today's sponsor, soup, the food that is juice, and sometimes ideas. So stories are influenced both by the long history of the pot and what went into it, but also the selections of the author who serves up the story. And this particular idea, this ingredient, the story of a gender-shifting Prince Charming, this has many different versions, not just going back a few hundred years, but in some cases, thousands of years. It is an old ingredient. As it turns out, Tolkien's essay about the soup and fairy tales began as a lecture, the 1939 version of his series of lectures about none other than Andrew Lang of the coloured fairy books. 1939. Wasn't that just after the publication of The Hobbit? Wasn't that while Tolkien was just starting to work on The Lord of the Rings? Okay, so If he was engaging seriously with Andrew Lang's fairy stories in 1939 in preparation for this lecture, could that mean he was reading the Violet Fairy book at that time? Well, apparently, in 2017, while moving old books at Oxford University, a librarian discovered in the pages of an old copy of the Yellow Fairy book a bookmark left by the last person to check it out, and that happened to be J.R.R. Tolkien. The librarians were then able to verify that Tolkien had indeed checked out that book in February of 1939 while he was researching for the Andrew Lang lecture, and, well, he just so happened to be writing the first chapters of The Lord of the Rings. They also found that when Tolkien checked out the Yellow Fairy book, he also checked out a bunch of other books, among them the Violet Fairy book. Okay, so we can confirm that on the 27th of February 1939, J.R.R. Tolkien checked out the Violet Fairy book containing the story The Girl Who Pretended to Be a Boy while he was writing The Lord of the Rings. And that may not prove that any of these fairy stories influenced The Lord of the Rings, except that the place where his bookmark was found was on the first page of The Dragon of the North, the story about the magic ring with the mysterious inscription. Remember, the ring doesn't have an inscription in The Hobbit. The inscription only appears in The Lord of the Rings, once it's been thrown into the fire to reveal the words. So it would make sense that at this time he was thinking about this Andrew Lang fairy story. His daughter Priscilla Tolkien remembers seeing the coloured fairy books all over the house at this time, and they read some too. Tolkien even cites the preface to the Violet Fairy book in his Andrew Lang lecture. And while not absolute proof, and he didn't even introduce Éowyn into his writings until a few years later, we can say for certain that Tolkien held that book in his hands on that specific day while researching fairy stories and while writing The Lord of the Rings. So maybe he was inspired by The Girl Who Pretended to Be a Boy. Maybe just a little bit, just a smidge. But if Tolkien was inspired by this story, then I do wonder if it's possible that it's also a reaction to it. I mean, reading this either as a kid or as an adult, I think Tolkien wouldn't have been too happy with what appears to be a woman marrying another woman, even if she did turn into a man at the end. I don't think he would have been particularly happy with a woman turning into a man either. Would he have been happy with any of the warrior women of mythology? Where our fairy tale Prince Charming wants to live as a man, happy to eventually have his body transformed and transitioned, Éowyn's victory depends on her return to womanhood. She reveals that, as a woman, the prophecy about men doesn't apply to her. She pulls off her helmet dramatically to reveal her long, beautiful hair, and from then on, she's on a journey back to happiness to the point of being hastily married off to Faramir to become wife and healer. Tolkien was originally not going to allow Éowyn to live past her gender transgression, having her die in battle. But instead, she is healed in a way which seems to contradict what she wanted most of all, to be allowed freedom beyond the confines of her gender, because her desire to fill a man's role was just a sign of her depression after all. Maybe this is the ending Tolkien would have preferred The Girl Who Pretended to Be a Boy to have. But regardless, the Éowyn of Tolkien's imagination isn't the best known version. The Peter Jackson films portray a different interpretation, a much more feminist one. Gandalf mansplaining her depression is cut, her ending in the Houses of Healing and hooking up with Faramir is cut, at least from the theatrical version. Yes, I'm talking about the theatrical version, the real version, the version edited with two hands, okay? They're the definitive versions according to Jackson, and the versions most people have seen, okay? Before you go all getting excited in the comments. You sit down, I see you. You sit down, you sit down. Éowyn is constantly arguing against the sexism she faces, and unlike in the book, this isn't some trick of Wormtongue. In fact, Wormtongue is a creep who objectifies her in the films.
What was the promised price, Screamer?
It may come as no surprise that the films were written by women. Éowyn's theatrical story puts much more emphasis on her relationship to King Theoden, her father figure, who refuses to let her come into battle. Unlike in the book, where he dies not knowing that she fought off the Witch King for him, in the film, she gets to be with him when he dies. She has proven that she was just as capable as any man all along.
I am going to save you.
This version has a little more in common with the dragon scene in the fairy tale, where Prince Charming defeats the dragon and earns the approval of the father. He says, "Now I see that you were as brave as the bravest, and as wise as the wisest. I doubt the filmmakers have ever heard of this story, but the films, perhaps intuitively, ended up restoring this ingredient of proving yourself to your father figure. And I think that most people over the last 20 years watching the films don't see Éowyn's bravery, her brilliance, as a symptom of depression or gender confusion. They see feminism in it, even if it does feel a bit cheesy.
I am no man.
It's such a great idea that the Witch King would overestimate his own immortality because of a comically sexist misinterpretation of a prophecy. He underestimated Éowyn, just as everyone else did. The Lord of the Rings is a polysemic work. There's no direct allegory. Tolkien hated allegory. He said, many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author. So to interpret his work in different ways is part of our freedom as readers, as he didn't intend to dominate as the author. You don't have to argue that he intended to write it as a gay story for a gay reading to be valid. Really, in a way, he would have wanted us to talk about Ringusi. It doesn't really matter whether he would have agreed or not with our reading feminism or transness into Éowyn, or reading Sam's love for Frodo as ever so slightly differently, even if it was in a way which didn't quite align with some unpublished notes in which he talks about how intense elf sex is. What is so beautiful about The Lord of the Rings is exactly its broad applicability. It's such a massive work, and it draws from so many sources, from the soup. And now I'm going to quote Ursula K. Le Guin, because I am, in fact, a parody of myself. Art reveals something beyond the message. A story or poem may reveal truths to me as I write it. I don't put them there. I find them in the story as I work, and other readers may find other truths in it, different ones. They're free to use the work in ways the author never intended. A poem of the right shape will hold 1,000 truths, but it doesn't say any of them. While not a very popular story in most places, The Girl Who Pretended to be a Boy lives on. Just a few years ago, there was a new queer feminist reimagining published in Romania. There's this Slovenian one here, and in a way, I kind of feel like just by talking about the story in this video, it's almost like a reimagining, a recontextualizing, telling the story anew. Because in the land of fairy, the story never really ends. What we think of today as the final version is just another step in a long history which someday people will look back on and say, oh, that's an interesting interpretation. Where will the gender-bending Prince Charming be in another 100 years' time? Where will Frodo and Sam be? Will there be an explicitly gay trans film version of The Lord of the Rings after it reaches the public domain? Yeah, there probably will. Who knows? But for certain, the stories will continue to evolve. Fairy stories will always reflect us and carry our ingredients in the soup of story. One can only hope for a good chef to serve it up. Thank you so much for watching. We have a podcast episode about the Lord of the Rings musical over on Patreon if you want to check that out. Otherwise, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much to Roxandra for helping me with the Romanian version of The Girl Who Pretended to be a Boy. Thank you to all of our patrons, and a special thanks to Two Slices, Aaron Fisher, Adzi, Elicante, Aaron, Agent Maxwell, AJ Mango, aka Ruth, Alexandres, Alex Harvey, Alien Cheryl, Alfie Pelle, Amanda Kruger, Amelia D, Anna, Andrew Kokemore, Anya Stefan, Anton Forkin, Arapaima Slim, Ariel Rodriguez, Artemix, August, Aurora Karabula, Bear With Me, Becky B, Bella, Besoro, Beslaf, Byroni, Birdie, Brain Douche, Break Every Yoke, Bump Girl, Buttons, Simois, Cat, Callum Parsons, Calypso, Cami Everett, Carl, Carmen who is definitely not in San Diego, Carrie Not the Kind of Girl You'd Marry, Katrina Lexi, Charis Edwards, Charlotte Heald, Chelsea S, Chloe G, CJ Gibson, CJ K, Claire, Clémence Levergue, Cleo McKeever, Comfort and Adam, Courtney Ray Kelly, Danielle Brabanda, David Prendergast, Dax, Deanna McMillan, Dennis Deems, Didruel, Divoleserine 120416, Donna, Dorothy, Eden Ladley, Erie Emby, Eleanor McDougall, L Like the L Word, Elora Welmisley, Elsie Astro, Emil England, Emma Randall, Emmanuel, Emotional Support Catboy, Emery James Fairgrieve, Enya, Erdbeer Strudel, Erica Lygren, Ethan Rackham, Eve Griffith, Evelyn Shell, Faye Crossroads, Fancy Angles, Fatal Drum, Faye Faye, Feo, Fickle Harpy, Fluffy Bunny Boo, Fox E, Frank McManus, Frederike Arens, fucking daft. Persona Urcon, Gabriel Popper, Gabriella Day, Gabriella, Gaewin Moonwater, Galileo's Balls, Gavin Salmon, Ghosts and You Might Die, Gillian Omotoso, Ginger, Grace Robertson, Grisala Farbin, Gwilym Perez, Gwen Zootown Nicholson, Gwenda Euphoria, Hannah Acker, Hannah Burgess, Hayley Labang, HB, Hida, Hunka Munka, Infotoxin, Issy Kostov, Jackie Queen of Thieves, Jackie Elise, Jam Girl, Jamie, Jamie Midge, Jackie K, Jax Monty, JK, Jessage, Gillian D, Joe McManus, Joseph, Jules Inkwell, Julia Bouldersdaughter, Juliana Baca, Julio Leota, Julio Mendez, Julia Sarwin, June September, Juniper Lopez, Justin De Lima, Kale, Carolina Olekainen, Kat, Kata, Catherine Lennox, Katie Ballinger, Kata, Katya, Kay Sarah, Kelatua, Kezia Garrett Smithson, Claudina Cott, Kyle Denley, Lama, Lee Fowler, Leggett Rem, Leland Culver, Lewis McLeod, Lee Hedstrom, Leanne Lermore, Lindsay Mercer, Lisa Spitalovitz, Lobster Mogster, Logan K, Logan Q, Loki Cassandra Harley Quinn Maylorin, Lorelei McLaughlin, Los Tunas, Maeve O, Margarita Stella, Marie Bass, Marlon Nolting, Mama Rayad, Marim, Math Class Warfare, Malka, Max Jarvella, Maxim Shulin, Meg, Megan Wesson, Melissa, Metavor, Mia Nilo, Michael Wolf, Mike McCaffrey, Minerva Gale, Mo, Mochibun, Mumba, Mrinmai Salil, Matete, Mirren McGlynn, Mickey, Nenifar, Nicholas Venturo, Nick Snary, Nikita Siganto, Nina Vangberg, Non-Anonymous, Nora Carlson, not specified, Oli1234, Olivia Omar, Olivia Thideman, Ollie Futur, Orange Stuk, Ossian Matthew, Paige McLaughlin, Panama Pauper, Panny Lynn, Paper Samurai 00, Pascal Andor, Patrick Button, Peace Frog, Pelks, Pietro Serra, Pinky Socrates, Primrose Farah, Pseudo Pac-Man, Public Loser, Rachel O, Rachel Rat, Rochelle, Radical Planning, Radden Rossborough, Ralph Giles, Raunchy Beeves, Reed Davidson, Rebecca Peacock, River Felix, River Haddock, Robin Ellis, Rolling Eddie, RSS, Ruxandra Greco, Riasa, Sabrina Gross, Salem, Sam, Samina Khan, Sarah Buchelman, Sarah R, Saria, Savannah Smith, Shockstopia, Scott A. Snellgrove, Sean Haskett, Sean Miller, Selenia Latovera, Sean, Sierra Kaplan Nelson, Sierra Rhodes, Sylvia, Simon Patience, Sakiki, Chaos Brat, Sithvich, Soham Banaria, Solisal, Sonia J. Smith, soon to be Dr. Worm, Sophie, Spencer Sign, Spooky Llama Tree, Starry Sunset, Stephen C., Stephen Gibson, Stephen Wallace, Summertime Killer, Susie S., Simone West, Tara Welling, Taria Peterside, Tegan Mulford, T. Michael, Tess McCrea, Taylor White, The Baskinator, The Fisherman and the Priestess, The Nihilist, Theo Falling, Tiago, Tim Anderson, Tiny Wooden Tree, Timmerlan L., Tom Harrison, Tovich Reponova, TRL Andrew, Troy Zaire, Valeria, Verlux, Vicious Panda, Vicky Green, Vince Whitaker, Vincent Reinfeld, Wards, Weeb Trash, Wesley Botham, Will O'Connor, Winter Ferger, Wizard, Wuzzle, Jonathan Zunga, Zaria Zamboni, and Zet. Why are you still here? Oh, I know. You want to hear me say Gandalf Big Naturals, don't you? I'm not going to say it.